Hello everyone, my name is Michael McCann and welcome to part 2 of this tutorial for creating an old house in Blender. Now I know that I said in part 1 we were finished the modeling, but there is one thing that I want to do. I'm going to select this cube at the top and I'm going to duplicate it with Shift D. And I'm going to position it in the front because I realized that the attic would probably have more than one window. And most of these old Victorian style homes have these little, I don't know what you would call them, they're sort of like extrusions from the roof where, you know, additional windows are. So we're just going to create these. So I can get rid of this whole side that has the window in it, and I can just select these faces and press F to make another face. And then I can scale these faces in on X rather than scaling the whole thing because I want the window to stay the same size. And press Ctrl R to add a loop in the middle and then raise it to a peak. And then select the top two faces and just extrude them up. And then I can scale them out and pull them down, just so that I get a nice little roof there. And I feel like that overhang is a little too much, so I can scale that on Y. And that looks okay, but it doesn't need to be that long, so I can select all of the back faces and push them forward. And then just delete those faces that won't be seen. And I'm going to duplicate that with Shift D and then move it over to this left side of the house as well. You could pretty much position these anywhere that you want, depending on how many windows that you wanted in the attic. And then of course just duplicate a window frame because our windows are the same size because we didn't scale them, we just scaled the sides. So duplicate the window frames and position them in, and then also the windows will have to also duplicate one of those and put those in as well. And then once we're finished with this, we can begin the texturing process. Well, first the UV unwrapping and then the texturing. I'm going to select everything with A and then move it up to where the grid floor would be. And then before we start UV unwrapping anything, I want to, if you've noticed, we've been separating some of these objects as we've been going. And the reason is when you have one mesh that's all one object and you apply a material to it, it applies the material to everything, and we want to keep the material separate for the time being. So I'm going to separate some objects. So for instance, I'll be selecting all of the faces that make up the roof on the part that we just added. And then I will select that and then the roof and hit Ctrl J to join them. And then I want the cross separated from the roof, so I'll select that and hit P and separate by selection. And so basically it's just a matter of separating anything that has a separate material. So this foundation, for instance, I'll select all of the faces that make that up. And the side of the stairs too, because that's going to have the same material. So I'll select those and press P and separate by selection, and then select those and then the foundation of the house and hit Ctrl J to join them, and then that will all be one material. And we will be rejoining all of these separate objects into one mesh at the end, but for right now it makes it a little easier to keep everything separated. So I want to select all these smaller pieces, like these little railings on the porch, and they're all overlaid on top of each other. So if I select UVs and choose Pack Islands, that separates them and organizes them really neatly in the texture space. So I can just select everything and hit G and X and move them off to one side. And now I can do the same thing for these larger pillars. I can select them and they are again overlaid. So I need to select UVs and then pack islands. And just like I did before, I want to select all of these smaller pieces and fit them into the rest of the UVs so that I can save on texture space. So when that's done, I'll select everything and move it off to the other side. And next I'll select these little arches that are supporting the roof. And I'll do the same thing, UVs and then pack islands, and that does a pretty good job of organizing them. And I'll just move those down. And next I think I'll work on these shutters, but I realized that in the first part when I modeled these, I probably should have marked seams on the corners before I duplicated them and put them around the house. But that's okay, because there's actually a really easy way that we can mark the seams on all of these. I'll just select all of these edges on the corner and then just type Control E and mark the seam. And now if I go to Select and then select Similar and choose Length, now all of those corners that are the same length are selected. So I can just hit Control E and then mark seam, and it will mark all of the seams on those. So if I select everything and then unwrap, it should unwrap them really neatly. But these two on top I'm going to move down to the side because I feel like later that will be easier to organize in the texture space if they're, all together horizontally. And so I'll move those up. And so basically really that's it. It's about taking care of all the smaller things first and then working on the larger pieces, like these walls for instance. I would probably just mark seams on every corner. Would be the safest way to make sure that I could fit everything into the texture space. So just mark all the corners and then Control E and mark seam. And I want to organize these window frames too, because that's another thing that needs to be organized neatly in the texture space. So right now all the window frames are one mesh object, so I can unwrap them and then choose UVs and pack islands to organize them a little better. Okay, so now I can start giving everything of their own material, so that after that's done, I can start connecting the mesh all back into one object. So here I'll just select the shutters and label them and give them a color. And here you can start sort of conceptualizing your color scheme as you're going, even though you'll probably change it a lot as you are adding your textures. It's good to at least start formulating a plan for your colors now. And once you've applied all of your materials, I can now select all of these smaller mesh objects and I can press Control J to join them. Now all of those materials are together. So if I look in my UV image editor, I can see that all the UVs are now there together too. And so therefore I can start organizing them in my texture space by scaling them down and then just taking my time to position them in the texture space. And even though these mesh objects are smaller than the rest of the house, I'm still giving them enough texture space so that they'll have some detail. If they don't have enough pixel space, then oftentimes, especially when you're baking lighting and shadows, you'll find some weird artifacts on the textures. So you definitely don't want to scale these down too small. Okay, so now we can start selecting other parts of the house and unwrapping them and slowly adding those to the rest of the mesh. So I'll select these stairs and then I'll unwrap them and scale them down. And now I'll select them in object mode and then those other objects and hit Control J to join them. And now I can just fit them into the other UVs. And then just continue this process, just selecting different parts of the house and unwrapping them in an organized way and then joining them with Control J. With some objects you want to make sure that you delete the faces that won't be seen, because that always helps with saving on texture space. And again, with larger objects like this foundation, I'll just select all of the corners. And then mark seams. And with the stairs, just mark seams so that they unwrap neatly. And these of course didn't, and it's because I have all these faces on the bottom and in the back that again won't be seen, so I can just delete them. And when you pack islands, sometimes you might see a better way to organize them. So I suggest just, moving them around in a way that, however you think is the most organized way that you can place them before you add them to the mesh. And again, I'll just select this piece in object mode and then select the rest of the mesh and use Control J to join them. And then I can just scale this into the texture space as well. And really for the other pieces, it's really just about putting together a sort of puzzle. You're trying to utilize as much texture space as possible. Then to unwrap these walls, I'm going to select the wall and then type Shift H to hide everything but the wall. And then I can just select these extrusions that make up the door and the windows. And then type Control E and mark the seam, because it'll be easier to unwrap if all of these smaller areas are separate. Now I can just select those larger UVs by holding Shift and clicking on them, and I have my settings set to Island Select. And I can move those out and then select all of the smaller pieces and then choose UVs and Pack Islands. And that way I can scale those smaller UVs down because they really don't need a lot of detail. The window frames will be sort of, blocking most of the texture anyway, so you won't see a lot of that mesh anyway. So I can scale that down really small. And then work on fitting those larger pieces into the texture space. Okay, so once you're completely finished your UV unwrapping, we are going to switch over to Cycles Render. And I'm going to open up my node editor and also have my UV image editor open. And then I'll split my view so that I have one view for rendering and one to, rotate around in and see which objects I'm selecting. And now I'll go to my world settings and click Use Nodes. And then down here I can switch between my object and world materials. So I'll just select this little world tab. And I'll type Shift A and add a texture, sky texture, and then plug it into the background node. And now my scene has a little bit of natural light. And then I can switch back to my object materials. And so next you'll want to go to a texture site like CG Textures and just select some textures that you'll use for your model. So click on roofing and you'll have to choose something for the roof. I'm going to go to wood and select this very detailed one here that looks pretty typical for those types of old homes. And then in wood, I'm going to find some painted planks to use as the siding for the outside of the walls. Something like this would work really well. But there are certainly lots of options. And the very best texture to use for creating an old, sort of abandoned type house is in painted plywood. It's this very first texture. It's really great. It's this peeled paint that's seamless, so it works really well. And once you've collected all the textures that you'll need, we can start applying them to the model. So I can just select the first material and click Use Nodes. And there's a really handy add-on. So if you go to User Preferences and then just type Nodes, you want to select this Node Wrangler. Just make sure that that's checked. And then when you type Control-T, it adds a texture coordinate mapping and a texture node. Now I can come over here to my object data and add a new UV map by clicking this little plus sign. And now the first UV map, which is the one that we've organized all those UVs and pinned them, I'm going to label that Bake. And I'll just leave the second one UV map. And I also want to leave the second one highlighted in blue and check this little render camera box, this little image here. Make sure that that's selected. Because now we can unwrap our mesh however we want and it won't affect those original UVs that we have that are nice and organized in our texture space. And I'll be talking more about these different UV maps later. But for right now, I'll just go back to my materials. And I can just select the walls and then just do a simple cube projection, which works well in most cases for almost any shape. It does a really good job of placing the texture coordinates so that they wrap really well around corners. So it works really well, especially for architectural structures like this. And I'm going to be texturing this model a little differently than maybe you've seen in other tutorials. And so I'm going to just demonstrate on this cube to keep it simple. And the reason is because we'll be generating our own normal maps and specularity maps. And if you're new to cycles, this is actually a really simplified way of texturing. So with our diffuse node selected, we can hit Control-T, which adds our texture node. And then I can just unwrap this with a Smart UV Project, which unwraps the UVs really neatly. But when I add a texture to that, you can see that the texture doesn't look very good, which is the reason why we need to add the second UV map. And now we click this little render icon and make sure that this one is highlighted in blue. And now we can unwrap this however we wish, which in my case I'm going to use a cube project, which looks great on the model, but in the UVs it doesn't look very good at all, not compared to our original Smart UV unwrap. So we'll be baking the textures from these messy UVs to these organized smart UV project. Now I'm going to type Shift A and go to Shader and then Glossy Shader, and then hold Alt and right mouse click and drag those two shaders together, and that combines them with a mix shader. But you can see that that's a little too glossy, especially for brick. So let's first start by taking the color of the image texture and putting it into the displacement on the material output. And that basically gives it some bump, like a bump map or a normal map. But it's really strong at the moment, so in order to take the strength down a little, we need to type Shift A and then go to Converter and Math, and then just drop that right in on that line. And then we can switch it from Add to Multiply. And if we take the value down, it decreases the strength of that bump. A 0.2 looks pretty good, but it's still way too specular, especially for a material like brick. So the way that we're going to adjust that is we're just going to plug the color of the image texture into the mix value of the mix shader. And Blender is looking at those values of light and dark to determine, so the darker parts of that image will be less specular, and the lighter parts will be, more glossy. But this works best with a black and white image. So if I type Shift A and then go to Converter RGB to black and white, and then just drop that in, now it's turned that image into a black and white image. Now if I type Shift A and go to Color and then choose Brightness and Contrast, and of course I dropped it into the wrong line. I don't want it going into the displacement, I want it going into the mix value on the mix shader. So in case I lost you there, I'll just go over what everything is again. So we have these three nodes, which are the texture coordinate node, the mapping node, and the image texture. And you can see that when you add a texture coordinate node, by default it's already set to UV, but there's other options in there too, which we might use some of those later. So that texture is going into the UV, which gives the object the color. And it's mixed with a glossy shader, which gives it specularity. And then of course the texture is plugged into the displacement. And then where we have this RGB, so if I click Control Shift and left click on the mouse, it allows you to see what that looks like. And then if I do the same for this brightness and contrast, we can actually see the effect of raising the brightness and contrast. And I really want to darken those darks and brighten those light parts up, because basically what will happen now is these really dark parts will have no specularity. The really white parts will have a lot of specularity, and the gray parts will have, a value of in between. So that looks pretty good, but it's still a little too specular, so we can just select this math node and type Shift D to duplicate it, drop it in, and change it from multiply to subtract. And that way at a value of 0 it would be really specular, and then if we increase it we're subtracting the specularity. Looks like a 0.4 looks pretty good. And so now we would be ready to bake our textures. So in the UV image editor, I would create a new image. And it's important to make sure that the camera icon is still selected on that second UV map. And I probably should have labeled that texture, but I just left it as untitled. But I'm going to duplicate this texture node And over here, I'm going to select that texture, which is Untitled. And this node needs to be highlighted. It needs to be selected in the node editor. So now in my Properties window, if I scroll all the way down to Bake, it's already set to Combined, so I can just click on Bake. And that bakes everything. It bakes the textures and the lighting and shadows as well, which looks really cool. But we, in the case that we want some normal maps and specularity maps too, well, that's really easy to do. All we have to do for the normal map is just switch this to normal and click Bake again. And the only reason that this will work is because we have something plugged into the displacement on the material output. That's the only way that you can bake out a normal map, but you can see it's there. And then for the specularity map, we're just going to go back to Combined. There's a lot of options in here. There's ambient occlusion and many other things, but we're just going to switch this back to Combined. And then holding Control Shift, we're going to left click on the brightness and contrast node. And now when we click on the bake, it's only going to bake those values to the texture. And there it is. There's the specularity map. And of course you would have wanted to save all those textures individually, but this is just the example, so I didn't save them. But now I'll show you an actual example on the mesh, and I'll be using this this cross that sits at the top of the house as the example. So I'll give it a new material and hit Control T, and then I'll open a texture that I have, just a normal metal texture. And now I can unwrap this however I'd like, because again we're on that other UV map, so I can just use a cube projection or a simple UV unwrap. And a simple unwrap worked pretty well. So I'll just make a little bit of room, and I'll plug the color from the texture node into the displacement on the material output. And that, of course, gave it the bump. Now I'm just going to make a little bit of room. So I can type Shift A and go to Shader and choose a Glossy Shader. And holding Alt and the left mouse click, I can drag those together to combine them. Now type Shift A and go to Converter and then Math, and drop that into the line going into the displacement, and switch that to Multiply, and lower the strength so that it isn't too bumpy. And now I can plug the color of the texture into the mix value on the mix shader, and type Shift A and go to Converter, RGB to black and white. Now type Shift A, Color, Brightness and Contrast. And I'm just holding Control Shift and left clicking so that I can see those values. I'm going to raise the contrast because I want those little dark areas which are kind of like the little notches in the metal, to not have any specularity at all. Now I can duplicate this math node with Shift D and drop it in, and again just switch that to Subtract, and then just play with the values on that math node to get the right specularity. So rather than me bore you by going over the same steps for every material for the mesh, just go ahead and apply all those steps to each individual material that you have. You might run into some areas if you do like a cube project on the roof, for instance. You'll find that some of the corners might not have wrapped around evenly because of the way that they are curved, Blender thinks that it's like the top of an object rather than the side. So you'll need to select those faces and then in the UV image editor just rotate the UVs so that they fit accordingly. With objects like the shutters, you'll just have to basically just select each individual one and scale them up with the texture as a reference. A really cool feature that was added just a few months back in Blender. It's for adding decals to the surface of a mesh. So right now I'm just unwrapping the floor of the porch with these this sort of wood plank texture. And what I would like to do is put a mat on the floor in front of the door. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to duplicate this texture with Shift D. And then I'm going to select this texture that I got from CG Textures. It's just this little rug. And I'll type Control T to add the mapping node and texture coordinate. But I don't want to use UV, I want to use Object. And I want to click this minimum and maximum, which will keep the texture from repeating. Now I'm going to put my 3D cursor in front of the door and type Shift A and add an empty. And then over here in the texture coordinate node, down here under Object, I'm going to select Empty. And then combine the two texture nodes by holding Alt and right mouse click and then just drag those together. And that combines them with a Mix RGB node. And you can see the rug there in the corner. If I select the empty and I move it around now, the rug will follow. So I can just place it in front of the door. I need to use the alpha from that texture and use that as the factor on the Mix RGB, and that helps to separate those two textures. And then in the mapping node I can just scale it and rotate it and do whatever I want. So it's a really cool and easy way to add a a decal to any material. And then of course this would be done the same way, except you would plug the color of the Mix RGB into the displacement. And then add a Glossy Shader, a converter math for the line that's going into the displacement, change it to multiply and then adjust the value. And again, the color right into the mixed value, and then the RGB to black and white, and the color, brightness, and contrast. And another tip, if you're looking to change the color of any texture that you have, for instance, I have these large beams, and I want to add that peeled paint texture, that peeled plywood, but I don't want these beams to be white. I want them to be like a greenish color to sort of match the shutters. So I can just type Shift A and go to Color, and then choose Mix RGB and drop it in. And then all I need to do is just change the second color to whatever kind of value or color that I have in mind, and then set this to multiply and just set the factor all the way up. And then I can just tweak this color to get it to something that I like, which is really why I prefer using cycles. You never have to settle for the textures that you're given. You have all of these different alternatives to these different options to customize the values and the colors of your textures, more so than in Blender Internal. So once you're finished all of your materials, then it's time to start baking them out to one texture. And so the way we're going to do that, we have to first start by adding a new image, and I'll just call this house. And it's going to be rather large, so I'll just add an asterisk after 1024. and 5, so it's 1024 times 5, and then press enter, and that does the math for you. And then I can just drag that number down to the bottom, to the height there, and it just adds it. So when that's done, I can just click OK. And again, this second UV map is what we're rendering, but we're baking it to the organized UVs. So select to bake under UV maps, which is this, again, this really organized set of UVs. Okay, so the house texture that we just created, we need to add that to every material that we have. So I'm just going to type Shift-A and select Image Texture. And then within the texture, select House. And you need to do this for every material. So if you have 30 materials, then every single one needs an image texture node that's set to that specific texture. And each node has to be highlighted. So it needs that that yellow border around it, like it needs to be selected in the node editor for every material. If it's not, then you won't be able to bake your textures. Now in my render options, I want to scroll down to sampling and then just change the render samples up to at least 30 because there are glossy shaders in all those materials, so that will help keep the noise down. And then in light paths, you can uncheck the reflective and refractive caustics because they don't really need to be there. And that will help eliminate some noise as well. So now down underneath of bake, there's this little margin and it's set to 16 pixels. I'm going to raise that up to maybe 30 pixels. And that will help to extend the texture a little farther outside of the UVs so that you can't see the seams. Okay, so there's our texture. That's our combined texture, so it's shadows and lighting and everything. So I'm just going to save this, so go to Image and then Save as Image. And I'll just leave it as House PNG. And now I can select all of these brightness and contrast nodes by holding Control and Shift and just clicking on each one. And it's also important to make sure that as you're doing that, each of the texture nodes is highlighted. So after you switch to the brightness and contrast, make sure that you're reselecting the texture node. And then just bake that again, and that will bake the specularity map for all of those materials. And I'll just save this image. I'll call it house_spec.png. Okay, so now we can work on baking the normal map. So that texture is already still selected in the node editor for each material, so we can just switch to normal and click bake. Now we'll save that. And there's actually one more texture that I would like to bake. And I'll explain why once we are back into Blender Internal. But unfortunately that means going back and reselecting this mix node from all of the materials. So just hold Control, Shift, and left mouse click on all of these mix nodes and then reselect the texture node that has the house texture applied to it for every material. And once you're done, just sort of rotate around your model to make sure that all of your textures are back to normal. You don't want to leave anything out. And then in your render options, go back down to bake and switch it from normal to shadow. And then just click bake. And here are all of your shadows, and you can see that these are like the little beams from the porch. But it also calculates the shadows from the displacement. So all these little cracks in the wood boards and such, which is pretty cool that it can calculate that. So now let's go ahead and save that image. And I think we're done. What we can do now is go into Blender Internal and then just reapply those baked textures to the model. So I'll go into textured mode. And it's all yellow because Blender Internal can't recognize the materials from cycles. So I'm just going to add a new one. And then add a texture. And actually, before we add that texture, let's go back. We need to assign this material to the mesh. And I'm going to make it shadeless. And now we can open up a new texture, and I'll just select the house.png. And I think it looks pretty good, actually. I'm pleased with the results. I think that cycles baking is awesome for models that are, especially if they're intended for the game engine, because it's just so much more realistic than trying to set up real-world lighting in Blender in the game engine, which is just virtually impossible to do. But now I can add that normal map. But first I'm going to uncheck the shadeless in the material settings, and I'm going to make my sun lamp a little brighter so that I can really see that specularity on the model. Okay, so in textures I'm going to open a new texture and find the normal map. And then scroll down underneath of image sampling and click normal map. And uncheck the color and then check normal. And the strength is a bit strong, so I'll just take it down a little. It still seems a little weak, so maybe I'll take it to a like a 0.25. Yeah, something like that looks a little better. And now I can add another texture, and this will be the specularity. And for specular maps, all you need to do is just scroll down and deselect the color underneath of the diffuse influence. And then under specular, just check color and the hardness. But not intensity, because if you check intensity, then you'll lose your control over the intensity in the material options. And that's something that it's good to be able to adjust when you need to. And so there's one more thing that I want to do in the instance that you are going to use your model in the game engine. And say your character has a flashlight and he were to shine it on an area where there's a shadow. Well, right now the specularity map would basically allow any of those areas to show some reflection or some specularity. So we're going to add in that shadow map. And we'll basically set this up the same way as we did the specularity map, except with one difference. We'll just, underneath of the blend type, right here, we'll switch it from mix to multiply. And that way it will ignore all of those white values and just use the dark values. So even though you can't tell that it's there, if I uncheck the color here, you can see that it's making a difference. All those dark values are still there. So now I'm just going to, underneath of a specularity, click all three of these. And now in the game engine, again, if your character shines a light there in the shadow, you won't see the specularity. So it's very useful. But that's the end of this. I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. I'll leave this blend file on my Facebook page if you want to download it and check the model out. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.